Let me begin by saying what a fascinating topic, and it's quite humbling to have to do this, and also daunting at the same time. But I just think it's best to put it in context, what the word humility actually means. And I'm sure all the other chapters around the world, all 100 of them, will be doing the same thing this morning. But humility itself is an actually Latin word, and it comes from the word humilis, and it, in its actual essence, means to be low. And on the way here, as Jeremy mentioned, we had a major launch for our campaign last night. On the way here, I just looked up a couple of things on humility, and it's quite interesting in the perspective of the way that we live our lives these days. But if you feel humility in front of someone, you feel small in the scheme of things. You feel that you are simple, an insignificant person. Someone who spends his or her life taking care of others shows humility, although it is not related to humiliation, which makes you feel low in a bad way. Humility is usually used to talk about the lack of ego. Humility is what makes life rich. That's very paradox in that too. When you feel low, you feel rich. And it's quite opposite to what we're taught through celebrities, what we're taught through public affairs, what we're taught through social media about if you can acquire so much, if you can gain so much, you'll feel rich. If you can obtain a certain status or position of wealth, you'll feel rich. And that actual essence of humilius, the Latin word which stands for humility, means if you are a position of low, if you do feel low and insignificant in comparison to someone around you, you'll get the benefit of feeling rich. So thinking about humility as it stands, I think there's a number of great examples, and you can spin from Martin Luther King to Mahatma Gandhi to Nelson Mandela, but I thought that the best example today would be, on the dawn of Anzac Day, would be John Simpson. And it's a very well-known Australian story, but I thought it's worth sharing as we head first into Anzac Day tomorrow. As many of you do know, John Simpson is a bit of a folk legend of the Anzac hero. And what you may not know is John Simpson isn't even Australian, though we pin him up as our folk hero of the Gallipoli offensive. John Simpson was a merchant sailor from England, and in 1913 he was so desperate to get back to England to see his widow mother that he decided to jump the ship and run away from the Navy in England. And he was in Sydney at the time, and then he travelled across to Perth and got to Fremantle and decided that it was time to go home. He toured across Australia in 1913, very different to what it would be like now. Well, the Nullarbor would much be the same. He got to Fremantle and said, the best way for me to get home to see my widow mother is by signing up to the war. As you all know, 1914, the Great War broke out, and Australia, as an ally to the UK, decided that it was time for us to send troops across the other side of the world, and we got led into the Gallipoli offensive, which for many reasons was the wrong place to be at the wrong time. But John Simpson said, hey, this is a free trip home. I can get back to Turkey. From there, I can hitchhike back to England. So John Simpson jumps on a boat and heads in 1914 over to Gallipoli. And as a Navy sailor with very few skills in warfare, he decided that he would join the first aid team. And with his donkey had a wonderful red cross on the forehead to symbolise that he was at peace. He just went up every day across the whole offensive, right up the slopes to carry men down, day in, day out for 3 weeks. It's an 8-month battle, as you may know, in Gallipoli, and a place that we may or may not have been. It's a good debate that we seem to have every year, where the English sent us in along the Anzac Cove. But John Simpson, for 3 weeks, went up and down, and he saved countless men. They reckon it could have been close to 400 or 500 men, up and down on his donkey, day in, day out. On May 19th, 1914, it'd be a bit harder in 1994. In 1914, John Simpson, again, headed out, but breakfast wasn't ready. And being a bit of a English larrikin, he yelled out to the guys, you bloody bastards, you better make me the best dinner possible. and jumped on his donkey and went up the slope again. He was shot in the heart that day and was killed. John Simpson himself had never shot a fire in the 3 weeks of war he'd been at Anzac. Never shot one fire, never had killed a person, had been there for 3 weeks helping save Australian and New Zealand men's lives. And that today has been the real icon of our Australian legend, this simple English man that went over to Gallipoli on our behalf, but on behalf of Great Britain too, that's now become the face of the Anzac hero. And a man that just wanted to go home and see his mother, that decided it was a great trip home, getting halfway home to Gallipoli, getting back to UK, has now become the face of the war memorials, the face of the shrine, the face of everything we talk about when we talk about the Anzac legend. And a man that you could describe as feeling that sense of insignificance and ability to say that it's okay to be low, it's okay to not be front soldier, it's okay to leave my job, occupation in the Navy and join the Australian Anzac legend and head over to Gallipoli. I want to share with you a couple of stories a bit more relevant than John Simpson and a bit closer to home than 1914, and walk you through a couple of stories around the work that we do and put in perspective how we run some of our work, and hopefully that has a side to humility with it too. But in short, as Jeremy mentioned, I run an organisation called YGAP. We find and enable impact entrepreneurs in developing communities under a fundamental belief that local people have the answers to local problems. We work in 7 countries across Africa and Asia based on a belief that if you're ever going to solve a problem like poverty, it's not about developing methodologies here in Melbourne or Oxford University or New York City. It's about working with local people. It's about understanding the local context and being part of a solution, facilitating that solution with local people. And so for the past 7 years, we've been doing so under a very strict sort of focus with our fundraising, that we will not be traditional with that approach. We don't receive any government money, no trusts and foundations, no monthly donation programs, no large bequest programs. Instead, we have creative fundraising campaigns and social enterprises that we run that funds our impact entrepreneurs around the world. It's actually 4 years ago when we started Kinfolk Cafe downstairs, which next month is actually turns 5. 2010 when we opened that. And so I want to take you on a journey with one person. I'm going to skip through a few slides. Sorry, I sent them very late to Jeremy last night. But I want to take you through a journey with one person that, without doubt, gave me a real perspective on humility and took me to a very low point in my life to know how destructive, especially men, can be. And it's a young girl called Thea, who I met about 18 months ago. We're very privileged to work with an organisation in Cambodia called Hagar International. Hagar not only work in Cambodia, they work in Myanmar, Vietnam, Cambodia and Afghanistan, essentially working with children coming out of the most severe human rights abuses. We're talking about children that have been trafficked through pedophile rings, children that have had acid burns and forced to beg on the street, children that have been so severely beaten up in domestic violence abuses. Children that have nowhere else to go, and we're not talking about 14, 15-year-olds, we're talking about children as young as 3 to 4 years old. Hagar are an absolute pillar of hope for children and a lot of women too in these 3-4 countries around the world. We've been working with Hagar on a youth education, youth leadership program for the past few years, and in September 2013 we took a major donor across to Hagar to see some of the work in Phnom Penh. After about 3 days, we were taken to a dinner on the Mekong River at a pizza restaurant. We had pizza and soft drink because all the 22 kids, all they wanted was Western pizza and soft drink. And sitting there, I got to sit next to a young girl called Thea, who was 10 years old. Now, it was a very loud, boisterous night, and everybody was jumping on top of each other with more and more coke that came out. But Thea, this 10-year-old, wouldn't speak to me. She wouldn't open up. She was very sheltered and quiet and reserved, and which is not foreign. A lot of Khmer women, unfortunately, women are second-class citizens. I'd even describe them third-class citizens in Cambodia, and I'll come back to that reason later. But this young girl just wouldn't open up, and the rest of the kids were so loud. I tried everything, noughts and crosses and hangman and playing rock, paper, scissors, but just wouldn't speak. 2.5 hours of a very, very quiet conversation, forcing 2 words out of her at a time. At the end of the night, she picked up a texter and coloured a love heart on my hand. And then she flipped my hand over and painted all my 10 nails in. Thanks to Thea, I left with 10 brightly blue painted nails. The next day, we're at the Catch-Up Learning School, where Thea and 124 other students are educators at bridging school before they get reintegrated back into a government program, government school. And Caroline, our project partner, said to me, "Oh, do you know Thea's story?" And I said, "No, it wasn't appropriate to ask last night." With her supervisor and everything on there, I had no idea. And Caroline went on to say that at the age of 8 years old, Thea's mother had to take her to a safe house. Thea's father had passed away growing up in a small village just outside Siem Reap, and as a sole breadwinner of the family, was unable to look after her. The forced decision to take Thea into a shelter was one that the mother didn't want to do. She agonised over it, but unable to look after herself, let alone her 8-year-old daughter. Tragically, the safe house was everything but a safe house. It was run by a French guy, and at the hands of this French guy and his friends for 2 years, Thea was raped on a daily basis from 8 to 10 years old. And Caroline stopped and said to me, "Do you know, Elliot, we work with 310 staff here at Hagar, Cambodia. 97% of our staff base are local Khmer people. 3% are international, but those 3% are all female. You're the first Western male that Thea's met since that ordeal." And so for me, that was a real moment of being low and very insignificant, knowing that at the hands of another Westerner, here I was, a 29-year-old male from Australia. As far as Thea was aware, Australia, there's no difference between France and Australia. At the hands of probably the second or third Westerner she'd come in contact with, besides some of the French guy's friends. I was sitting there, and no wonder she was sheltered, no wonder she was locked up, no wonder she didn't want to speak to me. And it was a very humbling and moving experience. And I said to Thea, through Caroline, the project partner, "Just tell Thea when I go home I'll wear nail polish on one of my fingernails." And then there's a bit of a bypass comment. And so for the past 18 months I've been wearing nail polish on one fingernail, still got my nail painted. Returned home in 2013 and at the time captain of my local footy club, and there's 2 teammates here that are designers and part of this wonderful CreativeMornings community. But coming home to pre-season football training at the end of 2013 with a bright red nail polish on, it raises a lot of eyebrows and questions the whole notion of masculinity. Why a male would be wearing nail polish? Given the opportunity, I can tell the story about Thea and how Thea had picked up a texter and coloured my nails in. We then went and looked into this issue of violence against children. It's not one of YGAP's focuses, but we got very passionate about the reality of why a girl at the age of 8 years old would undergo 2 years of this traumatic experience, and what happens to the life of a young girl like Thea. We discovered through our research that 1 in 5 children globally will suffer physical and or sexual violence before the age of 18. 1 in 5, and that's a conservative estimate from UN reports. 18.4% of children globally will be physically and or sexually assaulted before the age of 18. It's not isolated to Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam or Afghanistan where Hagar work. This is an international problem. An Indigenous child is 7 times more likely to be physically and sexually assaulted before the age of 18. A child in Australia, 1 in 28 will face physical and sexual violence before the age of 18. It's an Australian problem too. What really struck us in this research was the unequivocal fact that 95% of violence towards children is driven by men. And no matter where we search, the worst statistic we could find was 92%. Sorry, not the worst, the lowest. It's 92%. So with this in mind, we started to think, with all the incredible work that Hagar is doing, with all the great work that Childwise and some other wonderful organisations here in Australia are doing around violence against children, the conversation's always positioned on what happens after the fact, what happens with the trauma recovery, the reintegration, the rehabilitation. And it's a simple economic situation here. You've got a supply and a demand. For every child or every woman we take out of sexual servitude or violence, we're just going to be replacing it with another person because the demand's there. And so when we spun around the world and looked at campaigns and looked at initiatives and enterprises focusing on getting men engaged in this conversation, we only had 1 in South Africa that was doing something about it. found a few missionary groups in parts of Southeast Asia, but they were very aggressive and evangelising with their work. So we decided to launch a campaign called Polished Man. I should probably speak about our 5-cent campaign because it launched last night, but I think Thea's story relates a lot more to humility and the reason we're running a national campaign called Polished Man. Polished Man was the first campaign of its type where we tried to engage men in the process of this conversation, looking at men not as perpetrators, importantly, because as we know, as we hope you know, most men aren't perpetrating this violence, but it's the few that do. So instead looking at men as protectors, men as role models, men as leaders, men as change makers, looking at the positive aspects of masculinity, engaging men in a national conversation around what it means to actually be a male, what it means to deconstruct the notion of masculinity, what it means for a male to paint a fingernail, what a feminine thing to do. And in September last year, a year after I met Thea, we launched Polished Man, had 16,500 men wearing nail polish. One nail polish painted for 2 weeks in September to represent the 1 in 5 children that suffer physical and sexual violence globally before the age of 18. We're able to successfully have 247,000 separate conversations about violence against children, raised $250,000 in the space of a couple of weeks, have Chris Judd and Joe Watson at the height of all masculinity at the MCG with 72,000 screaming fans, Carlton versus Essendon in round 22, wear nail polish on the ground. There's 2 leaders shaking hands with nail polish on. Channel 7 doing filming in the rooms with these 2 absolute heroes of the game with nail polish on. Hamish McLaughlin on Channel 7 with nail polish on, talking about violence against children. And importantly then too, being able to draw it back to the reason we do it, to raise funds to support Hagar and Childwise here in Australia. Knowing that simple moment of meeting someone that I had in 2013, that moment of very insignificance and a low point in my life, knowing that another male, albeit from France, had committed this violence on a young girl at the age of 8 years old. And it's not violence that's immune from Australia too. We're well aware of lots of Australians, Americans, Germans that travel to parts of Southeast Asia for sex tourism purposes. Nor should I say it's immune just to sex tourists too. There's a major cultural problem in Cambodia where estimated 85 to 90% of Khmer men engage in prostitution. A huge cultural problem there. There's a country that was split apart in 1975 with the onslaught of Khmer Rouge, killing 1.5 million people in the space of a few years. Cambodia itself has a huge issue there around what it means to be a male, why treat women as second or third class citizens. And there's a saying in Cambodia, a man is like gold. Whenever the man is dirty, we can clean it, we can polish it, and then the man is clean again. And a woman is like a cloth. If the woman ever gets dirty, it will never be clean again. And that's the pervasive attitude right across Cambodia and other parts of Southeast Asia. The treatment of women and the view that it's not uncommon or even that bad that a young girl like Thea can be sexually and physically assaulted on a daily basis. I don't want to end you with a very dark story like that, so I'll share one more that maybe it's not as uplifting, but it's got a better ending. You're going to think, Jesus, this guy's going to commit suicide after this. But this is a wonderful young entrepreneur that I met in April this time last year. As I mentioned at the start, our new model that we've been working on for the past 18 months, our old model was more focused on the Hago Internationals, where we had major partnerships in local countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, where we worked in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Rwanda, Malawi and Ghana. But past 18 months we've been building this new model of finding and enabling impact entrepreneurs in developing communities. And testing this model, we went to South Africa. So the simple process of how we run this model is, why are we building classrooms, which is our first model for the first 5 or 6 years of YGAP's journey. We're building classrooms across Africa and Asia, running teacher training programs, running youth leadership programs like we had with Hagar, and we weren't having amazing impact. We impacted 30,812 young children's lives in the space of our first 5 years, and we were quite proud about that. We thought it was pretty good. But we'd raised millions of dollars to have that type of an impact, and that's a significantly, measurably impacting the life of a person living in poverty. It doesn't mean they get water for a day, it means they get water for a decade. It means they get an education for 6 years, and that's an international reporting mechanism around what we do with our impact model. But we weren't the best at building primary schools. We weren't the best at running teacher training programs. We weren't the best at the work we're doing. So we decided to flip our model and focus on what we're passionate about, be more innovative, progressive with how we spent our money, not just how we fundraised. And so developed this IP around finding and enabling impact entrepreneurs. And so went to South Africa, and our model is to find and accelerate. And so we put, through social media and traditional media, information out there to emerging entrepreneurs that are working on socially minded programs. And they can be enterprises, they can be for-profit companies, they can be social enterprises, they can be campaigns. We had 210 applications of the most remarkable young South Africans that have got big ideas, from agriculture to education to health and sanitation. And with that, we took the top 20. And this one girl, Labo, was probably about the second last to get into our cohort. And she had a model at the time that was good, but it wasn't great. She slipped into our program. When we met her, she told us her story about how at the age of 8 years old she was left homeless due to domestic violence. A father that so severely beat up the mother that left her and her sister homeless at the age of 8 years old. She then went on and with her mother fortunately we got an education at the age of 13, started working from the age of 12 to get an education, got through secondary school, was married off to her, someone in the community at the age of 21. She told me in a car ride that if I wasn't beaten up 4 times a week, it was a good week. She said most times it was 5 or 6 times a week. 70% of women in the northwest province of South Africa, where she's from, Metiklu, face domestic violence on a weekly basis, 70%. And so she describes a good week as only being beaten up 4 times a week. 6 months into the marriage, a forced marriage, she decided that she was out. Now, leaving a marriage in Metiklu is an absolute cardinal sin. Nobody does it. And Labo, at the age of 22 at this time, decided to come out. Was ousted by her community for the second time in her life, left homeless due to domestic violence. Rather than what most of us would do, turn to drugs and alcohol and anything that can escape your pain, she decided to start a clinic, the Mutu Network, and started a clinic for 12 to 14 women every Friday night where they could get a safe refuge because Friday was payday. And paid a security guard and got a bit of funding to support 12 to 14 women. Had such a high demand that she had to have applications on the Monday to get women in on the Friday. Now when she came into our program, we said, Labour, what an awesome initiative you're running. And on this basis, about 400 to 500 women a year you're directly supporting and providing and preventing them from violence on that Friday night. But let's look at a bigger problem here. There's 40 clinics in Metiklu, in your province of northwest part of South Africa. Most are at risk of being closed down due to government funding, due to lack of accreditation, due to ill-equipped resources. 24 of those 40 were threatened to be closed down next year by the government. We said, why don't you look at a program? You're a smart, intelligent, dynamic woman. Why don't you look at a program that better facilitates and equips all of the centres rather than just building another centre, a part of that 40? She flipped her model now. She's built an accreditation program and a training program for all 40 centres which remain alive, with new streams of funding that she's attracted from the government, which new philanthropic funding. She's raising over $250,000 for all of these centres. She's also pushed it a bit further and now working on not just the northwest province of South Africa, but right across South Africa. Barack Obama, when he was in South Africa in December 2013, said the hope of South Africa lies in the hands of 3 people, and went on to tell Labo's story. For us, we're a very, very small part of her journey, getting her to just change her thinking, pivot from her model, and now, on an annual basis, she's impacting over 12,000 women and children every year. And we put her through a 1-week accelerator program. She was, after sneaking into our top 20, she was one of the top 5 that received funding and went on to the secondary program, which is our Changemaker Plus program, and received funding from us and has gone on to do incredible things. What we want to do is fill this pioneer gap. 88% of global social entrepreneurs that get flown out to New York to meet Hillary Clinton, they get to shake hands with the who's who of Bill Drayton's in the social entrepreneurship sector. 88% of these global social entrepreneurs in Skoll Foundation, Acumen Funds, Echoing Green, are Ivy League trained or equivalent. They're coming from the best universities around the world. The Oxford universities, the Harvard universities, and equivalents. And that really frustrates us. To have any impact on ending poverty, it's not about those government ministers' sons and those with money to get across to Harvard and Oxford. It's about filling that pipeline with the best local change makers, the best local impact entrepreneurs, like Labo, who's in their community fighting the problem day to day, who knows a solution to this problem. So what we're trying to do is accelerate them and their ideas to fill that pipeline so they get access to major funding with the big international social entrepreneurship firms around the world. So I thought, although a bit dark to a degree, it's not immune from this country and it's not immune from our lives too. And I think it's important to talk about these issues because when we're talking about issues of humility, we do have to go to dark places to know how low we can get as individuals, to know how insignificant we need to become to fight for people that are voiceless and that have no opportunity like Thea to break away from their perpetrators and their captors, to give the support and the guidance to people like Labo so they can have a much better impact than the 400 to 500, moving on to 12,000, and she'll go well beyond us. She'll be impacting hundreds of thousands of lives. For the most dynamic woman I've ever met in my life in the next few years, right across South Africa. Hundreds of thousands of lives that should be going on to impact. And so I thank the Creative Mornings team because it's a wonderful topic to choose, a hard one in every sense, but I think the easiest place to leave is just thinking about that humiliation isn't a bad thing at all, and keeping in mind that you do need to go low and be insignificant and drop that sense of ego when we live in a society that tries to teach us the exact opposite. How great you are, how wonderful you are, how good that picture on Instagram looks, how you compare to your friends, what your social status is. But in reality, as that saying that I said at the start, the riches come from those that consider themselves at the lowest point. And that's the essence of humility, and that's the essence of being a person that's true to yourself. Thank you again.